Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. There's something evil lurking in Hoosier National Forest. I've been more than a little hesitant to post this, but after what just happened on my last hike, I feel like there's no other choice. The parks may suffer for it, but people have to know. There's something evil in Hoosier National Forest. Possibly more than one. I've had similar encounters in multiple parks within HNF. Enough to make me question if one thing could be responsible for all of them. I've been followed on trails before. I've heard voices out in the woods that couldn't possibly be real. People who were too far away to be there. People who were dead. I once heard my granny's voice coming from a cave in Hemlock Cliffs. On my last hike, I went to Mogan Ridge, hiked the East Trail. It was scenic and beautiful. A nice day, if a little humid, not too sunny, not too windy. The hike was going wonderfully, until I realized that something was following me. I've seen and heard a lot of weird things in the woods, but this blows them all out of the water. Or woods, rather. Nothing I've seen or heard has ever come close to being this. I was about 3 miles out when I started putting together the weird sounds. Crunching noises, like someone chewing on ice mixed with joints rolling, coupled with a slithering sound like something heavy being dragged through the leaf litter. I was out there with a friend, because hiking alone is stupid and dangerous. I noticed the sounds first. I stopped walking to listen for a second. I think I said something like, "Hey, John, do you hear that?" When my friend stopped to listen to, the slithering stopped. The crunching kept going, though. It was a really nasty sound, the kind you can feel in your neck that makes your spine want to twist up. Like somebody chomping down on something hard, like that sound when you roll your neck or crack your knuckles. The kind of sound you can feel in the fillings of your teeth. It was unsettling enough that neither of us wanted to stick around and find out what was making the noises. Neither John or I are fearful people, but something about those crunching noises sounded wrong, out of place and threatening. We started walking again, and the slithering started up again. At first we thought maybe it was my walking stick making the dragging noise, but when I held it up away from the ground, the slithering didn't stop. John suggested weakly that maybe we were dragging our feet, and that was what was making the noise. But we both knew that wasn't it. The trail was too steep and too rocky to drag your feet on. Our next guess was a snake, but snakes in Indiana don't get big enough to make dragging sounds like whatever was making that creepy slithering sound. That was about when we started to hear the heavy breathing, like somebody behind us was panting down our necks. Once that started up, we really began shitting ourselves with fear. Because black bears have been sighted recently in Harrison County, a stone's throw from Perry County where Mogan Ridge is. We were certain that any second a bear was going to jump out of a stand of trees and eat us both alive until the whispering started. At that moment, we knew it was not a bear. Bears do not whisper. Nothing in the woods whispers. Not even mockingbirds. That just made it so much worse. Because whatever was breathing down our necks, whatever was crunching and slithering behind us, it was speaking, and it knew our names. John, John, Ash, Ash, John, 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 Ash, Ash, Ash. Look at me, John, look at me. Ash, look at me. Turn around, turn around, turn around. Look at me. And all the while it whispered, the chomping sounds continued. I began to fear that those sounds were it chewing on the bones of the last hiker to come through here. I braved a glance over at John, and John braved a glance over at me, and there were tears running down his face like the Ohio River was flowing out of his eyeballs. I can only assume the same look of terror and despair was etched into my own face. I wanted nothing more than to run away. Run all the way to the end of the trail and get in the car and never, ever come back here. To never go within 10 feet of another tree ever again. But the hill we were climbing was too steep to run up. I could only walk, slowly, up the hill. This This thing behind me all the while, whispering to me, saying my name. I don't know how long it went on, hours, maybe. It felt like days. We ran whenever we could. Wherever the ground was flat enough, we ran. But no matter how fast we went, we could never seem to outrun it. It was always right behind us, whispering in our ears. Ash, 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 such a waste of talent, such a waste of potential. Will your parents miss you when I've stripped the skin from your flesh? Will they notice you're gone when I've sucked the marrow from your bones? I thought the nightmare would never end. I thought I'd die on that trail, my bones picked clean and scattered among the rocks. No one would ever know where I'd gone. That I dragged my friend to death alongside me. I've never run so fast as I did when I realized the trail had begun to loop back around to the trailhead, that I was almost to the car, only a quarter-mile more to go. I don't remember falling. I only remember something grabbing my ankle and pulling me down, dragging me backwards. The sound of my own screams ringing in my ears. John screaming. John pulling on my arm, dragging me out of the creature's grip. Crawling up the last hill on my hands and knees, rocks slicing into my skin. Screaming. And then light. The parking lot. John pulling me back to my feet, running to the car. As we pulled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, I looked back, and I saw it. Tall, corpse pale, skeletal, skin stretched taut over bones. Hunched over on all fours, limbs inhumanly long with too many joints. No eyes, only gaping holes in its face. A grin of blackened razors as it watches us pull away, lifting one skeletal arm up to wave at us, a single human arm clutched in its grip, torn off at the shoulder. Second story. The Wendigos I grants wishes. I never knew how my grandfather came to possess the Wendigo Psi, but it was one of the few gifts he gave me, so I didn't want to ask too many questions. I only asked one, though, and it seemed relevant enough. Is it real? Tommy, don't bother trying to solve every mystery in life. Just enjoy what's given to you. Grandpa's stare, narrowed and angry, told me that there was a price to pay for inquisitiveness. So I just nodded and palmed the glass I gratefully. Grandpa then sat back and told me about how the Wendigo is associated with greed, murder, and cannibalism. Nothing good. That rainy night when he told me about the horrible creature like he had known it all his life is the last real memory I have of him. It was the last time Grandpa visited my parents, and when they went to visit him, they told me I couldn't come. When I asked them why, they gave me the same look that Grandpa gave me, angry, but also strangely hurt, as if I offended them for inquiring at all. My parents took many trips to Grandpa's cabin, always alone, always giving me that odd look. Then one time they came home, seeming almost relieved about something. No matter how much I prodded, they wouldn't tell me. They just wanted me to travel up to the cabin with them next weekend. Being a minor still, I couldn't really say no. Not meaningfully. But they didn't know that I could have secrets too. I never told them about the Wendigo Psi. As I sat on the edge of my bed that night, rubbing the smooth glass against my palm, I wondered why all of a sudden they were okay with me visiting Grandpa. Nothing good can come of this, the Wendigo's voice, guttural and mildly insane, said in my mind. I never heard the creature's voice in all the years I had the eye, not in my waking mind anyway, except for the last several weeks. Do not trust your parents, said the Wendigo. If you go up to that cabin, be prepared. I had a nightmare that night. Didn't remember much of it, but I remember having to wipe the dream blood out of my eyes. What a horrible nightmare, I thought. You know how you can't recall a nightmare, but the general feeling? Well, that's exactly what happened. The nightmares continued throughout the week too, and I couldn't recall much, only the horrible feeling right afterward. The nightmare feeling I experienced the night before my trip to the cabin was especially terrifying. I felt sick to my stomach, throwing up half-consciously. When I glanced up, I saw something that made me think I was still dreaming. If you go up to that cabin, be prepared, the Wendigo said in its guttural, horrifying voice. Its eyes were a stark yellow, piercing into me as I wiped vomit from my mouth. I stared into the pitch-black emptiness of the Wendigo's eye socket. Your grandfather gave you a gift. Use it wisely. Wish upon a star, or even better, the thing that lets one see into someone else's soul. I lost consciousness again and woke up a short time later, to the silence of the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of it, instead contemplating my wish. The Wendigo never said if I only had one, but I thought about my wish as if I did. As we took the long drive up to Grandpa's cabin, I couldn't get the Wendigo's eye off my mind, playing with it inside my hoodie pocket. I thought about the nature of the eye. The Wendigo said it could let you see into someone else's soul. But, for some reason still unknown to me, I didn't care about what they were thinking or feeling. Instead, I used the eye to probe my soul. I realized I was greedy. Money was power, and sometimes you had to do dastardly things to get both. Except what Grandpa said occurred to me again, as if he spoke right into my ear. The Wendigo was associated with greed, among other things. Greed is a gateway drug, Grandpa's voice said to me. He had mentioned this adage to me years ago, and in that moment I didn't really put it together, the seeming inconsistency. He seemed to despise greed, but carried the eye of a being associated with it. Even gave it to his own grandson. I started to get angry, then a numbness flooded me. I didn't really care. I only cared about sating my own greed and contemplating the nature of the eye and my nature. Had I been greedy all along? Or did the eye make me greedy? It seemed a little irrelevant given my current ambitions, yet I still couldn't help think the same thoughts over and over again. Grandpa's voice became a clicking whisper in my ear, repetitive and irritating, and a split second later womb-like and comforting. The drive continued in an awkward silence. We still had several hours to go. I grew increasingly anxious as we left the sprawl of the city and the confines of small sleepy towns. We were headed down a road that narrowed to accommodate the thick lines of trees on either side. I wondered why I was hearing Grandpa so clear now despite the deafening silence of the last few years. Maybe the Wendigo thought I would listen if he sounded like someone familiar. I didn't really know. It seemed to echo not only ancient wisdom but a more recent form. What happened up in that cabin? I thought. And what has been happening up there the last few years? Something strange must have occurred between my dad, mom, and grandfather. The eye burned lightly in my hand, telling me of the darkness I hadn't been privy to but also politely reminding me that I had a wish to spend. Just the one. I asked it. Just the one, the voice responded. I have some time left, I thought. Don't rush me. I know you're evil. You're trying to shape me. You could throw me out the window right now, but you'll die broke and alone, and you know what's worse? You're wasting your time using me to probe your soul when a wealth of knowledge is just waiting on the other side. It took me until that moment to realize I really missed Grandpa. He was a curmudgeon, dark as hell, spineless as fuck, but he wasn't afraid to explore the dark side of the world, things that were hidden in the darkness that most people cared to ignore. As his gravelly tones faded from my mind, I focused the eye on my parents. My mom seemed fine, filled with pleasant thoughts about me, but my dad radiated such a negative feeling for me that it seriously took my breath away. He seemed to hate me, because none of it made any sense. I always thought my dad loved me, but the eye revealed such a visceral hatred that I was left dumbfounded. Can't kill him yet. My dad's thought pierced straight through my heart. And you know what? Because of the wisdom of the eye, I finally knew my wish. I felt like I had matured by a decade during the rest of the ride to the cabin. In the blink of an eye, I guess you could say, I grew up. No gray hairs or anything, but now I possessed a mind seasoned with experience. As I helped Dad collect firewood, I kept getting the sense that something was off with him. Something was off with me too, so I couldn't really find fault in that perception, but it felt like again he was immensely angry with me. Not even mine. I could hear his thoughts say, in lower, almost demonic tones. He looked right at me when those thoughts popped into his mind, and it occurred me then that only the negative thoughts of my dad were visible to me. When I focused the eye on Mom, I couldn't find any thoughts at all. She seemed oblivious to the thoughts inside my dad. I kept asking him why we couldn't go into the cabin right away and see Grandpa, and Dad just grunted like he couldn't think of a good reason. Honestly, I was tired of being yanked around by the both of them. They had been very tight-lipped, and even now that we were now supposedly so close to him, what the fuck was going on? My frustration grew, jaw clenched. I rubbed the Wendigo sign in my hoodie pocket, finally attaining the grit I needed to make my wish. Not even mine. The anger and greed emanating from Dad's thoughts almost overpowered the anger fueling my wish. I wished for the Wendigo to purge the greed in my family to make things whole again. I couldn't get what the creature said out of my mind about greed being a gateway drug. I figured it was best to confront this head on. Dad stared angrily at the eye-shaped glow in my pocket, biting his lip as if he just went mad. "You just ruined everything, Tommy. I can't believe I put up with you for so many years. Well, what I learned that day is if you ask the Wendigo, you shall receive." I can't remember if Dad had given me the axe we used to cut down branches, or if it somehow appeared in my hand, but I grasped it anyway, so tightly that my knuckles went numb. Just as Dad lunged, eyes yellow like the Wendigo's, I drove the axe into his head, watching the blood drip down my fingers and forearm. The yellow light faded from Dad's eyes, and I felt as if I could enter the cabin. Something strange had indeed been happening during all those visits. Grandpa said he held the keys to a small fortune, or rather, he had given me the key. I held it firmly in the palm of my hand, watching as Grandpa stared at me with the eyes of the Wendigo. He said that the creature hadn't always been with him, but as the years melted away and Grandpa began collecting a small fortune, it started to take notice. And not just amassing wealth, but how one goes about it. Grandpa killed many people over the years, a bachelor living in isolation, a drug-addicted fool, the demented and easily tricked. But the Wendigo said that wasn't enough. So he picked the bones of the drug-addicted fool clean. When he approached me in the cabin, my mom watching in an almost resigned horror, he told me that the key to his treasure was the eye in my hand. But a virgin eye, one where no wish had been asked, and none had been granted. I told him I did make a wish, that my family be purged of greed. I swear Grandpa looked exactly like the Wendigo then, yellow eyes generating hate like heat from a furnace. Skeletal snout snapping, drool coming from some mysterious eternal hunger. He told me that only a virgin eye could open the trapdoor in his cabin, a room filled with so much wealth I'd never have to work a day in my life again. I still don't know if the dad I had for all those years was my actual dad or not. Mom says yes, he was. Who else could be my dad? We're still driving though, driving far away from the cabin. The words, "not even mine," echo in my head still. I'm angry and feel like I've been cheated. It seems like greed is still alive and well in my family. In me. I can't tell what Mom is thinking. Her eyes are on the road. She says she's taking me to meet someone. My real dad? My thoughts are only partially on that, though as momentous a moment as it will be, I'm still thinking about the eye. Since greed is still alive in me, it hasn't been purged from my family. Of course, a wish took away the eye's virginity, but I'm wondering if the Wendigo is lying to me. The wish hasn't been completed, and who knows what will happen when I meet my real dad for the first time. Will I kill him too once the rage and paranoia fills me again? If I can access the room underneath the trapdoor, I'll be a rich man. I'm thinking that's as equally important as family, and I have decisions to make. Third story. Maybe the national parks aren't just there to preserve nature. Yellowstone. He's not far now. Our guide indicated some unseen sign at the base of a nearby pine tree. I nodded my head knowingly and did my best to give the impression that I cared deeply about catching up to the elk. I didn't much like the outdoors anymore. But in grad school, trying to stand out, I'd made the mistake of putting hiking and exploring the national parks in the interests section of my resume. Much to my chagrin, this inclusion had labeled me outdoors guy at my job. And when my boss Owen invited me to join a group for a team building retreat to a hunting lodge in Wyoming, I didn't dare decline. So I found myself hefting a hunting rifle through the Wyoming woods in a light October snow, and wanting very badly to return to my cabin. What did you see? Owen's question snapped me out of the rumination. Tracks, the guide responded. Pretty fresh. My boss lit up in a wide smile, eager, no doubt, to return to our group with a trophy. How far do you think he is? Can't say for sure. The guide looked off into the distance. Close enough that we'll keep going on foot. I looked longingly back at the gray pickup truck we'd left behind. Owen, several years older, and decidedly soft around the middle, looked equally despondent. We continued through the trees, quiet for a few moments, until Owen's warm baritone again broke the silence. So you've been out here long? The guide chuckled, and deep wrinkles gathered around his eyes. I used to be ranger. Spent 20 years in the parks, including Yellowstone. Retired a few years back, and I've been leading trips for Stone Creek ever since. At the guide's mention of our hunting lodge, I thought again of my sumptuously appointed cabin. Something in my face must have betrayed me, because when the guide turned back to us, he shot me the sort of indulgent look that outdoor working types often give inside city folks. How about you boys? Spend much time out this way? Yep, I shot back, mildly offended by his look. My dad was a ranger. I spent a lot of time in the parks as a kid. The guide paused and seemed to reevaluate for a moment. He stared at me, as if searching my features. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, Owen interjected with another question. I hear some spooky stories coming out of the parks. My boss looked expectantly back to our guide. People going missing, that sort of thing. Did you ever see anything strange out there? My stomach dropped. A coyote with two snouts flashed through my mind. I tried to keep a neutral expression, though, and the ranger saved me by answering quickly. Oh sure. You see all kinds of strange things. Kids turn up miles from their parents in places they couldn't have gotten on their own. Hikers hear impossible sounds coming from the trees. That sort of thing. The parks are big though, and there's a lot of them. So, just statistically, some odd stuff is going to happen out here. He waved his hands at this final dismissal in a nothing to see here gesture. But as he looked from me to Owen, he paused for a moment on my face, and we locked eyes. I knew then that he was lying, and he knew that I knew. And we shared a brief moment of silent understanding that stretched on until Owen interjected again. Huh, your dad ever tell you about any of that? He looked at me expectantly, and I tried desperately to concoct some way of ending this line of conversation without being rude to my boss. The guide must have seen my discomfort, though, because he saved me again. Look there. He gestured to the base of another spruce. We're close now. I didn't see anything in the spot he'd indicated, but whether he'd seen a sign or not, the distraction proved effective, and Owen dropped his line of questioning. We continued on again in silence. After only a few moments of blessed quiet, the guide raised a hand and put a finger to his lips. Owen and I stopped in our tracks, pausing at the crest of a hill. The guide pointed into the distance and I followed his finger. For a while, I saw nothing, and I searched the landscape for some sign of whatever he'd indicated. The Wyoming woods had grown thicker around us as we'd left the pickup truck behind. The light October snow was beginning to stick, and a thin layer of white had settled amongst the pine needles. The snow wasn't so heavy that I couldn't see clearly, and I scanned the rocky hills below us for some sign of our prey. After a moment of searching, I spotted it. Far in the distance, perhaps a few hundred yards away, a set of antlers peeked out from behind a copse of trees. I grinned. Frightened though I might now be of the outdoors, I had truly loved nature for most of my life, and the prospect of landing a big bull elk still excited me. I turned back to my group. Owen was looking through a set of binoculars, scanning the woods as I had, and the guide waited patiently for him to spot the animal on his own. On cue, the shrill call of a bull elk sounded through the trees. If you've never heard an elk's bugle, the sound is equal parts comical and terrifying. The creatures call out in a high, piercing whine that, depending on the animal, can sound almost like a screaming child, the screeching brakes of a poorly maintained car, or the whir of machinery. but the sound is distinctive and unmistakable. You know it when you hear it. Owen looked down from the binoculars, and while I suspected he hadn't spotted our quarry, he seemed satisfied that we were on the right track. Our guide pulled a long, tubular call from one of his many pockets and put it to his mouth. As he blew, a similar sound, nearly identical to the call we just heard, echoed forth. His call was answered by another bugle, and the three of us exchanged excited looks. We trekked silently through the trees, down the hill, and toward the spot where we'd seen the antlers. As we got closer, our guide put up a hand to stop us. "All right," he whispered. "We're getting close enough that we might be able to take this guy. But if anyone asks, we got him a few miles back the way we came from." Owen and I didn't answer, but our puzzled expressions must have been clear enough, because the guide quickly answered our unspoken question. "You're not allowed to hunt in Yellowstone. I think we crossed into parkland about a half a mile back." His words hit like a punch to the stomach. The excitement of the elk hunt evaporated, and I felt only a sinking, creeping dread. Since Shenandoah, and a mural that wasn't a mural, I hadn't dared to venture even close to the parks. In fact, I'd done all I could to avoid them, declining invitations to go hiking or camping at every turn. But here I was, years later, back in one of the godforsaken national parks. I stopped involuntarily. The guide carried on, though, either not noticing or ignoring my reaction. I know all the rangers on duty, and neither of y'all would get in trouble. But still, it's a hassle I'd rather not deal with. Owen nodded conspiratorially, and I did my best to fix my expression. Apparently, I didn't quite manage it though, because Owen weighed in to reassure me. "See, you're not going to get in trouble. I'm sure it happens all the time." He looked to our guide for further reassurance. But the old ranger spotted something in my face that Owen hadn't. He fixed me with the same look he had when I mentioned that my dad had been a ranger. Again, he seemed about to say something, but another bugle cut him off. He turned, and we continued down the hill and into the woods. Slowly, we stalked closer to the elk. Circling around the spot we'd last seen it, we approached from behind. At the guide's insistence, we readied our guns. Owen would take the first shot, of course, as he'd financed the entire retreat. I hoped I wouldn't have to follow up, though, because my hands had begun to shake as my fear of the parks took hold. Our boots left faint, nearly invisible tracks in the thin layer of frost that was now accumulating atop the dirt. Snow has a way of muffling noise, and I could hear only the sounds of own breath and an increasingly frantic heartbeat. Again, the guide held up his hand, and we stopped. I spotted the antlers again, through the trees. They were closer now, about 100 yards away. I stared, fixated, as the antlers shifted. I held my breath, and the silent, still wood seemed almost to do the same, as I readied myself for the beast to move. Owen knelt and brought the rifle to his shoulder in a practiced motion. The antlers shifted again. All was still. Then, slowly, inexorably, the antlers moved from behind the distant tree. Or rather, their owner moved, and the antlers came with it. And as the beast came into view, it became clear that whatever the antlers were attached to, it certainly was not an elk. The antlers ended in sharp, vicious points that did not seem entirely natural, and grew from a head that seemed to belong to a human, or something that had been a human once, long ago. The crown of its head was round and entirely bald. Its face had the same general shape of a man's, 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a mouth. But where a nose would ordinarily be, it had only a small, bulbous snub and 2 snake-like slits. Its eyes, I could see even from a distance, were a cold, piercing blue. Every other part of the creature was bone white, and had it not been for the antlers, I might not have seen it against the snow. The creature was thin, but its limbs were corded with sinewy, ropey muscle. Its torso again looked like something that had once been human, but a human that had been stretched and twisted so as to be almost unrecognizable. Long arms hung nearly to the ground. Beneath an emaciated rib cage hung a distended, protruding belly. Thin stick legs with backward-facing knees ended in tufts of white fur and large black hoofs. Its enormous hands, tipped with long, filthy nails, held the shredded remains of what looked to have once been a rabbit. The creature, now fully in view from behind the tree, opened its red-stained mouth to reveal rows of long, knife-like teeth. And from that horrifying maw came the shrill, whining bugle of a bull elk. The crack of a rifle sounded through the forest, and the creature's head snapped backwards. I looked back to find the ranger, rifle to his shoulder, aiming at the distant horror. I spun my head again, back to the creature, as it slowly looked back upwards, and then turned its head, nearly 90 degrees, to look directly at us. The ranger's quiet curse snapped me out of my daze. Owen, too, stood now and looked frantically to our guide. In the distance, the beast dropped to all fours. Run. The simple command was all I needed. I turned and bolted back in the direction we'd come from. My rifle jostled uncomfortably against my back, and as I sprinted, I shrugged out of its straps and left it on the path behind me. Ragged breath and pounding footsteps told me that Owen and the guide followed closely behind me. I willed my legs to move faster. Only once, briefly, did I chance a backward look. The beast had covered the distance between us in impossible time, galloping on all fours in a frenzied, loping sprint. It was so close now that I could see shreds of rabbit in its teeth and across its mouth. The guide sprinted just behind, but as I turned, he paused to lift his rifle again. I saw Owen, too, sprinting behind me, red-faced and laboring up the hill. The abomination was nearly on top of him. I saw the fear in his eyes, as he no doubt heard the monster following closely on its heels. The crack of a rifle echoed through the woods. A muffled curse followed shortly after, and Owen's pitiful cry came next. "Help me," he called out, and his warm baritone wavered with fear. I'm ashamed to admit it, but in that moment, a single thought rang clearly through my mind. I didn't have to be faster than whatever was chasing us. I only had to be faster than Owen, and I was. From behind me, a thump, a wet ripping sound, and a horrific, tortured scream confirmed it. The guide's muffled curse followed. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow. The ranger caught up to me, sprinting to my right, and the look that crossed his face confirmed all that I needed to know. Owen wouldn't be leaving Yellowstone, alive or dead. A pounding behind me signaled the beast to be done with my boss. For now, we're almost there. The guide screamed his assurance through ragged breath. They can't leave the parks. I thought of a coyote sprinting on its hind legs through the West Texas desert until it stopped dead in its tracks, as if it had hit a wall. And I thought of a desperate hurdle down Skyline Drive. And I knew that the old ranger was telling the truth. So I sprinted, lungs burning, chest heaving, faster than I'd ever moved in my life, toward an invisible finish line in the distance. And I could see it. I can't explain how or why, but I saw it, only a few yards away. The trees didn't look any different. The ground didn't look any different. But some instinctual part of my brain drew a line through the woods in the distance. And I knew that if I could just make it to that invisible line, I would be safe. Drawing on reserves I did not know I had, I sped up. I could hear the beast pounding hoofs. I was so close. I could smell its rotting breath. Yards away, I could feel its labored breathing. Nearly there. I wasn't going to make it. The abomination stench, its breath, its pounding feet. They weighed on me like a physical thing, nearly on top of me. I resigned myself to a horrific end when the ranger's piercing yell cut through my panting breath. He collapsed on the ground just in front of me. I reached down mid-stride, hoping desperately that I could help him as I hadn't helped Owen. But as I reached for his arm, I realized that he was grinning. I realized, too, that I could no longer feel the beast behind me. Slowing, I chanced to look backward, and I saw it, only a few yards away, still, and staring at me. I had made it. I stopped and stared as the creature turned, stood back on two legs, and sauntered, almost casually, back into the woods. I knew then that the ranger had been correct, that we'd left park property, and that, bound by some law I couldn't properly understand, the creature could not follow. I collapsed next to the ranger. He continued to grin madly as I splayed out, spread-eagled on the dirt. My chest heaved, and I realized dimly that my coat and pants were soaked through with cold sweat. I shucked my jacket and lay there for a moment, looking up to the sky as snowflakes spiraled softly down to earth. After a moment, I raised myself to a sitting position. I don't know quite how long we sat there, the ranger and I, staring into the woods, not saying a word. "Help me." The desperate cry ripped through the winter air. "Help." Again, in a familiar, warm baritone. I stood. "Help." The ranger stood and put a hand on my chest. Without a word, he shook his head, sadly. I thought of the elk's bugle that we'd heard through the trees, and I thought of that high, animal whine coming from the creature's mouth, and I thought of the tubular call the guide had put to his lips, believing that it was we who lured a wild creature toward ourselves. And I heard the voice call out again, "Help me," and the guide turned from the woods and walked away, and I followed. We reached the pickup perhaps 15 minutes later. We drove back without a word. The ranger broke the silence as we pulled up to the ranch. He said only that he'd fix things with his bosses and my coworkers to explain why Owen hadn't returned. I didn't ask what he meant. Instead, when we got back, I made a beeline for my cabin. I lit a fire in the fireplace. I made a cup of coffee. I shed my clothes and left them in a pile on the floor. And I gathered a blanket around myself, and I sat in front of the fire. And I wept. Sometime later, perhaps only minutes, perhaps hours, a knock interrupted my sobs. I dried my face on the blanket and hastily pulled myself together. I opened the door to find the familiar, lined face of our guide. He cocked his head in a come-this-way motion, and I followed him outside. The two of us sat together, side by side, in the rocking chairs out front of my cabin. We rocked back and forth for a moment, neither of us quite ready to break the silence. The old ranger spoke first. "What's your last name, son?" I told him. He nodded, as if he'd been expecting my answer. "I figured you were O.L. Danny's boy." I turned to him, shocked equally by his casual reference to my father, and by the fact that, after the day's events, I was even capable of shock. "You look just like him." I thought about the night my dad hadn't come home. I didn't respond for a while. Then, slowly, almost resigned, I asked, "What the hell, man?" I wrapped all my questions into the one. The coyote, the bear, the elk thing. With that single question, I asked about all of it. So he told me, and he didn't know much more than I did. But that night as I cocooned myself in the cabin's sumptuous bedding, I figured that it was like this. We learn in school that the parks preserve nature. They keep people out to prevent them from spoiling the natural beauty. But that's not all they do. Somehow, by some law I can't understand, the parks keep things in as well. And like an old couple in Big Bend, like a gray-eyed man in Shenandoah, like my guide, and like my dad, I was going to help keep it that way. Fourth story, the Wendigo. I am writing everything down in this journal to document our journey to Fort Kent and the subsequent events that transpired afterward. I hope that whoever finds this journal will publicize what had happened in this town to us between the dates of January 12th to February 13th, 2018. Do you know of the Fort Kent Wendigo in Alberta, Canada? Most would say it is an urban legend, but after what I have read and experienced, my view has taken 180-degree turn. It all started when myself and a group of 3 friends wanted to make a Bollywood movie about the Wendigo. After spending 2 weeks of researching the Wendigo and what they looked like, I found the Wendigo of Fort Kent. Some say that a doctor locked himself in his house with his dead wife that had just died of smallpox. Then he ate her and turned into the Wendigo. Along with his wife, many of the townsfolk died from smallpox. Once the man left his home, He killed and ate the remaining dozen or so residents of the town. No one is really sure about what happened, but there is one fact no one can deny. Fort Kent became a ghost town, and no one really knows why. After finding out all of this information, I knew that we had a great idea for a movie. The only problem was the place was pretty isolated. So if we got into any trouble, it would be days before anyone would be able to help them. Luckily, Bobby's parents were filthy rich, since they were both plastic surgeons. They spoiled Bobby rotten and gave him everything he wanted. Even so, he was a pretty down-to-earth guy and one of my best friends. Along with Bobby, there was Mike and Kylie. As for myself, the producer of the soon-to-be movie, my name is Tara. So we took off in a small jet, heading from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada to Elk Point Airport, Alberta. We took a fancy Canon 80D DSLR camera with us to shoot the movie, as well as a portable field mixer, a wireless microphone system, a shotgun microphone and boom pole, wind protection for the mics, a field recorder, and headphones. Along with all of that equipment, we brought camping equipment. When we got to Elk Point Airport, we rented a Hyundai Tucson, loaded it up with all of our equipment, and headed for Bonnyville. Now it usually takes 45 minutes to an hour to drive to Bonnyville, but we were going in January. They had just gotten 24 cms of snow, and the roads were heavy with snow. It took us 3 hours to get to Bonnyville, where we got groceries and lots of alcohol for our month's stay in the ghost town of Fort Kent. For a bit of background, the four of us have been friends since elementary and just graduated high school. We decided to take a year off before heading to college and came up with the bright idea of making a horror movie. Bobby's parents had given Bobby the sound equipment and camera as a graduation present. We spent the summer figuring out what we were going to film when we came across the urban legend of the Wendigo of Fort Kent. Since then, we have been obsessed about the film. After we had gotten the essentials needed for our trip to the ghost town, we headed for the fort. January 12, 2018, Day 1. We arrived in Fort Kent around 2 p.m. It took us 4 hours to set up all the tents and gear. We decided to set up near the outskirts of town. For some reason, we felt more comfortable here. No one said anything, but everyone got more nervous the further we went into town. By the time we were all set up, the sun had already set, and we couldn't see anything past the glow of the bonfire. We decided to drink the night away, talking about all the things we would do once the morning came. Around 10 p.m., we started to notice snowflakes starting to fall. We huddled around the fire more, but when the wind started picking up as well, we decided to call it a night. We had 2 tents set up, one for me and Mike and the other one for Kylie and Bobby. Mike and I lay on top of a blow-up queen-sized mattress that had 3 heavy covers on top of it. The 2 of us got under the blankets and looked up at the ceiling. I could feel Mike trying to get into my pants, but I shrugged him off. This place was giving me a bad vibe, and I wasn't in the mood. The walls of the 8-person tent shook as the wind and snow pummeled against the tent, making it difficult to hear anything. At the time, I didn't think anything of it, but I swore I thought I could hear the howl of a wolf through the sound of the wind. January 13, 2018, Day 2. I woke up around 6 a.m. this morning to Mike snoring beside me. His arm was draped around me as my eyes slowly opened. The tent was still and the sound of the wind was silent. I brought my hand up to his arm and pulled it off of me. I rolled off the bed and pulled myself off of the floor. I quickly got dressed. To my surprise, it was warmer inside than I thought it would have been. I put on a parka and toque and opened the flap that led outside. A foot of snow fell into the tent the moment the flap was open. I let out a startled, silent meep and jumped back. I looked behind me, wondering if I had awoken Mike. To my relief, he was still snoring away. I composed myself and pulled myself out of the tent and into the snow. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked outside. I stood at 5 foot 8 inches and had the snow reach up to my knees, so overnight we had gotten a fair amount of snow. So it took me by complete surprise when I saw a set of footprints traveling through the snow around our tents. I figured that Bobby must have gotten up during the night and had a smoke. So again, I didn't think much of it. I looked towards the town. 2 run-down houses stood about 100 feet away. Then I looked to my right and saw our rental vehicle completely covered in snow. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning off the vehicle of snow. By the time I had finally gotten it cleaned, the rest of my friends had gotten up and started walking around. Bobby had taken out his camera and started to film the area. The last I had seen him, he was heading into town with Kylie while Mike came over to me. We talked a while about the project we were working on. We didn't have any shovels, so getting the SUV out of the area we were in was very difficult. Eventually, after much effort, we got the SUV out and onto the soft snow. The 4-wheel drive made the situation a little better. We both got into the SUV and drove it through the town. We followed the footprints that seemed to go to each house in the town, until finally the footprints went to a house and there weren't any footprints coming back out. We parked the SUV on the side of the road, got out and headed to the house the footprints went to. Turns out, the house had looked like someone had been living in it recently. We found them in the basement. Bobby was filming writing, which was covering every square inch of the basement. On one side of the wall it read, "Beware the Wendigo." As the writing went along the wall, the writing got more and more messy. By the end, the writing became scratches in the wall. Finally it read, "I am the Wendigo." We did some more shooting, making an introduction to the movie. By the time 4 p.m. came around, we decided to head back to the campground and pack it in for the night. By the time we got back to camp, it was pitch black outside. We parked the SUV beside the tents and all 4 of us headed inside mine and Mike's tent. We continued to drink and had a cold dinner from soup cans. We played cards until 10 p.m., right until we heard a howl coming right outside of our tent. We had been talking pretty loudly, so we hadn't heard it approach. We could hear the sound of crunching snow under heavy footprints. Then its shadow cast itself on the tent, and the only thing we could see were its legs. Not only was the creature bipedal, but it was huge. Mike was about to open the flap to check what it was, when we heard the sound of metal being torn to pieces. The sound of the car alarm going off as it did. I wanted to scream, but I was too terrified to do so. Soon the sound of metal being torn to shreds stopped and silence ensued. I was about to let out a sigh of relief when I heard another howl. Then the sound of the other tent being torn to shreds could be heard. After another 5 minutes, the sound faded and we could hear the creature walking away from our tents. We waited until midnight to get out of our tent and see the damage. The car and tent were destroyed. We had left most of our food in the car, and from what we could see there was no food left. Kylie started to cry and Bobby tried to console her, while Mike and I just stood there in shock wondering what we would do next. Bobby had brought his camera into our tent, but the sound equipment he had been in his tent and was now destroyed as well. We realized that our project was finished and we would have to go back to Bonneville in the morning. We didn't get much sleep that night, and this was only the tip of the iceberg. Our stay in Fort Kent was only just starting. 5th story. I was the star of a deep webcam for 40 days. Do you know that a person can survive without water for only 3 days? But Mahatma Gandhi was able to survive as much as 21 days without food? Those were things I used to know as a normal student in a small town. I know none of those things anymore. I just know about rage and feeling constantly hungry. I was in my last year of high school and working a part-time job so I could save money for higher education. Things were dull, but mostly fine until an otherwise normal afternoon after classes. It happened in the light of day. I was shoved inside a vehicle with expertise. I never saw the faces of the men that took me. I never saw their vents stinking of old blood and rancid food. I could only see the blackness of my blind and taste the slight sweetness of chloroform before I lost my senses. When I woke up again, I was completely naked in a poorly lit room. The state I was in made me expect the worst, but there was no pain or bleeding indicating that kind of violence. It was cold, and there was a maddening dripping sound. Something was gleaming in the dark. As soon as I adjusted my eyes, I realized it was a knife. Drip, drip, drip. The small room had nothing but an already dirty toilet, the knife, and a crack on the ceiling dripping slimy, slightly green water. The walls and floor were gray and featureless. A very strong light, like a camera flash, popped into my face, blinding all my senses with the shock. It disappeared after a moment, and I heard a voice. "We want to watch your suicide. Let's see how long it will take." They took someone unremarkable, frail, with nothing to live for. But now I had a purpose. I had to frustrate my captors. If they wanted to watch my suicide, I would be the most resilient person in the world. I wouldn't grant their wish. Back then, I didn't know I was being watched by a bunch of sick and twisted people who kept up with my daily misery in the comfort of their houses and their anonymousness. I slept on the cold, hard floor, food never came, and the only source of water was the murky leak on the ceiling. I drank it, humiliated. It tasted worse than shit, and I would know that, since I fed on my own waste during the first few days. The only indication that a day had ended was the blinding flash and the same cold, mocking voice telling me that they were surprised I had made it so far. I was so hungry, so hungry, so hungry. The room was getting hotter from my breathing every day. There was no proper ventilation. It seemed to be just enough to not let me die from carbon monoxide poisoning, a merciful death compared to the one they planned for me. I didn't know why they chose me. I still don't know. I never wronged anyone. I never excelled at anything to be a target of one's envy. It was just a purposeless act of evil. The fact that it was completely random made my hatred grow, and, with it, my determination. My stomach hurt beyond words. I was constantly sick from the putrid smells all around me. My body ached all over. My skin was matted and flaky, my hair falling from malnutrition. I grabbed the knife. I felt watched in cruel anticipation. Not today. I chopped off my left pinky and shoved it in my mouth before I could think too much about it. My own blood dripped on my chest as I chewed on my own bones. The crunching sound should be so sickening. My teeth should be hurting so much or even breaking bone against bone. I should be horrified to phagocyte a part of my own body. But I was just so happy to be eating. After that, I felt my body growing stronger every day, like a member of the cannibal tribe on Papua New Guinea after ritualistically feeding on their departed loved ones. I laughed maniacally for hours at a time and trembled endlessly, but I was more alive than I've ever been in that captivity. I rationed my food/body wisely. I needed my right hand, so it was crucial to spare at least 4 fingers on it, but I was free to feed on my left hand. My toes were pretty much useless. I've been dragging myself on the floor to move around anyway, but I didn't need to feed on myself for long. No more than a week after I first took a bite on myself, the voice after the blinding flash had something else to say. "We are selling you." The official story is that I miraculously escaped my perpetrators during their flawed operation to move me to my new owner. And by the time I had reached a neighbor and the police was called, they had already fled the crime scene. The investigation was kept under extreme secrecy, so I didn't make the world news. Hell, I only made the local news as local teenager mutilated by unknown man. Someone even donated me a prosthetic hand. The police was able to take down the website where my daily torture was being streamed nonstop, and just then I found out that I was a star. I laughed for days because everyone felt so bad for me, not knowing that the torture I endured was way beyond losing a hand and a few toes. I laughed for days because I know the truth no one else does. I know how, right when they opened the door to my prison, my body felt like it was possessed by a bestial creature, and, before I knew it, I used superhuman strength to crush the bones of 5 men all at once, then eat their fresh corpses whole. I even licked the leftover blood from the walls before I opened the doors and headed to the closest house, dragging my bad foot. In that moment, I felt like I was the co-pilot of my body. The wheelsman was a voice screaming kill and devour. I could never escape if something hasn't taken hold of me. I'm not strong or even fast. I'd do anything to spend the rest of my life quietly, having my body and mind slowly heal and recover from a devastating trauma. The problem is that eating the raw flesh of my captors was the most pleasant experience I've ever had in my life. And while I've been chasing mercilessly all the monsters that watch my suffering for their own enjoyment, I'm too hungry. Their tainted flesh has not been enough for me. No, for us. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.